Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something ancient, sacred, and absolutely unforgiving. Living in Egypt during the 10 plagues. Not the sanitized Sunday school version with cartoon frogs and dramatic music. The raw, horrifying reality of watching the most advanced civilization on Earth systematically destroyed by supernatural judgments beyond human comprehension. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on this spiritual journey. Now, turn off all the lights. The screen will also dim in a moment to help you relax as you listen to tonight's story. Let's ease into our biblical journey together. Now you're in ancient Egypt, roughly 1450 BCE. The mighty kingdom of the pharaohs surrounds you, not in museum displays or movies, but in smell, sound, and touch. The good news: you're living in the most powerful and prosperous nation on earth. The bad news: divine judgment is about to transform your paradise into a living nightmare that will make you question everything you've ever believed about the gods, about power, and about survival. The air around you carries the life-giving moisture of the Nile, mixed with the scent of lotus blossoms and the comfortable aromas of prosperity. Bread baking in outdoor ovens, incense from a dozen temples, the sweet smell of dates ripening in groves that stretch beyond the horizon. Your home isn't a modern apartment with running water and electricity, but a mud, brick dwelling that depends entirely on the predictable, life-sustaining rhythms of the great river that makes all civilization possible. The sounds aren't traffic or notifications, but the reassuring rhythms of the most stable society humans have ever built. Merchants calling their wares in the marketplace, children laughing as they play by the river's edge, priests chanting their eternal hymns in nearby temples, the gentle splash of irrigation channels carrying Nile water to fields of barley and wheat, and underneath it all, the eternal whisper of the Nile's current, the heartbeat of your world. This isn't a disaster movie with special effects and escape routes. This is survival during the systematic collapse of everything that makes your world work. And you're about to discover that your gods, your technology, your entire understanding of how the universe operates means absolutely nothing when the creator of all things decides to demonstrate his power. You wake up this morning like you have for thousands of mornings before. The Nile rises and falls with mathematical precision every year. The sun god Ra travels his predictable path across the sky. The pharaoh, himself a living god, maintains cosmic order through his divine authority. Your world makes sense. It works. It has worked for over 1,000 years. Walk outside your door and breathe in the magnificence of Egyptian civilization at its peak. This isn't the Egypt of crumbling pyramids and tourist traps. This is the Egypt that built those pyramids. The Egypt that makes the Babylonians nervous and keeps the Hittites awake at night. The Egypt that invented mathematics advanced enough to build monuments that will still stand in the 21st century. Your neighbor is an engineer who can calculate the precise angle needed to build a pyramid that won't collapse under its own weight. The scribe down the street reads and writes in hieroglyphs more complex than any alphabet system that exists. The physician who lives near the temple can perform surgeries that European doctors won't master for another 3,000 years. You live in the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, but more than technology, you live in absolute certainty. The Nile floods every year between July and October, depositing rich black silt across the flood plains. Farmers plant their crops when the waters recede. 3 seasons, perfectly predictable Aket, the flooding Peret, the growing Shimu, the harvesting. Your grandfather's grandfather could tell you exactly when to plant and when to harvest, and his predictions would be accurate to within days. This predictability isn't just practical, it's spiritual. The flooding represents the tears of Isis, mourning her husband Osiris. The sun's daily journey shows Ra's eternal battle against the forces of chaos. Every natural phenomenon has a divine explanation, a place in the cosmic order that the pharaoh maintains through his godhood. The Nile isn't just a river, it's the bloodstream of civilization itself. Without it, Egypt would be nothing but sand and death, like the desert that stretches endlessly to the east and west. But with it, you have the richest agricultural land on the planet. Wheat and barley grow in abundance. Date palms provide sweetness. Papyrus reeds give you paper more sophisticated than anything other civilizations will invent for centuries. The river provides transportation more efficient than any road system. Boats carry goods from the first cataract in the south to the Mediterranean delta in the north. Trade routes connect you to Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean islands. Gold flows up from Nubia. Cedar wood comes down from Lebanon. Exotic spices and precious stones arrive from mysterious lands far to the east. You can see the evidence of prosperity everywhere. Massive temples with pillars thick as redwood trees, decorated with gold that would bankrupt modern nations. Sphinxes with human heads and lion bodies, carved from single blocks of granite, so perfectly that joints are invisible. Obelisks that will be stolen by Romans and Europeans thousands of years from now, so perfectly balanced they can be moved without cracking. The people around you reflect this prosperity, well fed, clothed in fine linen, adorned with jewelry that displays sophisticated metallurgy and gem-cutting techniques. Even the farmers and craftsmen eat regularly, live in solid houses, and have access to medical care that includes surgical procedures, dental work, and pharmaceutical treatments derived from hundreds of plants and minerals. Your society has specialized to a degree that seems almost modern. Professional soldiers with bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots, architects who design buildings that require mathematical calculations involving pi and complex geometry, artists who create paintings and sculptures with perspective, proportion, and color techniques that European Renaissance masters will rediscover with amazement. The religious system provides meaning and structure for every aspect of life. Hundreds of gods oversee everything from childbirth to the afterlife. Elaborate temples employ thousands of priests who maintain daily rituals, offer sacrifices, and intercede with the divine powers that keep the cosmos functioning properly. The pharaoh himself serves as the essential link between heaven and earth, ensuring that Ma'at, truth, justice, order prevails over Isfet, chaos, lies, disorder. This morning, like every morning for centuries, you can count on the sun rising, the Nile flowing, and the social order remaining stable. The Pharaoh will make the right decisions because he's divine. The priests will perform the right rituals because they understand the gods. The farmers will grow enough food because the river will flood at the right time. Your world is predictable, prosperous, and protected by the most powerful military and the most sophisticated government on earth. But today, something changes. Moses, an Egyptian, raised Hebrew, who fled to the desert 40 years ago, returns with his brother Aaron. They demand an audience with Pharaoh, not to negotiate, not to request, but to deliver an ultimatum from a God you've never heard of. A God with no image, no temple, no place in your organized pantheon. A God who claims authority over your gods, your Pharaoh, and your entire civilization. The demand is simple and ridiculous. Let my people go. Release hundreds of thousands of valuable slaves who build your monuments, work your fields, and maintain your prosperity. Give up a labor force worth millions in modern currency, because a desert god says so. Pharaoh's response is predictable and rational. Increase their workload. Make them produce bricks without straw. Demonstrate that this unknown god has no power in Egypt. Moses returns to the palace. This time, he brings proof. Aaron throws his staff on the ground before Pharaoh, and it becomes a serpent. Impressive, but not unprecedented. Egyptian magicians can do the same thing. Jannas and Jambres, the court sorcerers, throw down their staffs, and they also become serpents. Magic versus magic, god against gods. But then Aaron's serpent swallows theirs. Completely. No trace remains. Still, one magic trick doesn't prove anything. Egypt has the most sophisticated magical knowledge in the world. Your priests can predict eclipses, calculate the flooding of the Nile, and perform medical procedures that seem miraculous to less advanced civilizations. Whatever trick Moses learned in the desert, Egyptian wisdom can match or exceed. The next morning, you walk to the Nile to fill your water jars, as you have done thousands of times before. The river looks normal. Fishermen are casting their nets. Children are playing in the shallows. Priests are performing the dawn rituals to honor the river god Hapi. Everything is as it should be. Then Moses and Aaron arrive at the riverbank. Aaron raises his staff and strikes the water. Immediately, the entire Nile begins to change. Not gradually, not in one spot, but everywhere at once. The clear, life-giving water turns deep red. Not muddy red from stirred-up silt, but the thick, viscous red of blood. Fresh blood. The smell hits you immediately, metallic, organic, nauseating. The fish begin to die. All of them, instantly. Millions of fish floating to the surface, their silver scales reflecting the morning sun as they bob in the blood, red current. The fishermen pull up their nets in horror, finding them full of dead fish and thick, coagulating blood. The children scream and run from water that now looks like an open wound. You try to understand what you're seeing. The Nile is sacred. It's the source of all life in Egypt. Hapi, the river god, protects it. Sobek, the crocodile god, lives in it. Isis's tears create its annual flooding. This water has never failed you, never hurt you, never been anything but life and abundance. But now you can't drink it. You can't cook with it. You can't water your crops or fill your irrigation channels. The smell of rotting fish and stagnant blood fills the air. Flies begin to swarm over the dead fish that clog the riverbank. The sacred river that connects you to the gods has become a stream of death. You run home to check your water jars, hoping that somehow the water you collected yesterday might still be clean. But when you lift the lid, you find blood. The water in every jar, every cistern, every reservoir throughout Egypt has turned to blood. Even the water in rock pools and wooden buckets, every drop of water in the entire kingdom has become undrinkable. For 7 days, this continues. 7 days without clean water in a desert country where water means life. You dig wells, hoping to find clean water underground, but even the groundwater runs red. You try to filter the blood through cloth, but it remains thick and foul. You attempt to boil it, but the stench becomes unbearable, and the blood remains blood. Thirst becomes desperate. Your tongue swells. Your lips crack. Your children cry constantly, begging for water you cannot provide. You watch your neighbors growing weak, their skin becoming loose and dry, their eyes sinking into their skulls. The most advanced civilization on Earth is dying of thirst in sight of the greatest river system in the world. Finally, the blood clears. The Nile runs clean again. Fish return. The water tastes sweet and pure. You fill every container you own, drinking until your stomach aches, grateful beyond words for simple, clear water. Surely this was a fluke, a strange phenomenon that your priests will soon explain. Perhaps the gods were testing your faith, or demonstrating their power in some way you don't yet understand. But before you can fully recover, the second judgment arrives. It starts with just a few frogs. Nothing unusual in a river delta. Frogs are common along the Nile. But these frogs don't stay by the water. They hop into your house. Not just one or two, but dozens. Then hundreds. They cover your floor, your furniture, your bed. When you try to sleep, you feel them hopping across your body. Their cold, wet skin touching yours in the darkness. You wake up to find frogs in your kitchen, in your grain storage, in your water jars. They've contaminated your food, and there's no way to clean it. Every step you take crushes frogs under your feet, filling your house with the sickening smell and slippery mess of amphibian death. The croaking is constant, day and night, a deafening chorus that makes conversation impossible and sleep unthinkable. But it gets worse. The frogs are everywhere, not just in your house, but in every house in Egypt. They fill the palace bedchambers. They hop through the temples, contaminating the sacred spaces where priests offer sacrifices to the gods. They clog the ovens, making it impossible to bake bread. They swarm over the market stalls, ruining all the food for sale. You try to escape them, but there's nowhere to go. Step outside, and you're walking on a carpet of frogs, so thick that the ground itself seems to be moving. The roads are impassable, not because of barriers, but because every surface writhes with amphibian life. Children refuse to leave their houses, but inside is no better than outside. The smell becomes overwhelming. Millions of frogs, many of them dying from being crushed or from lack of water, create a stench that makes breathing difficult. You wrap cloth around your face, but the odor penetrates everything. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, everything smells like rotting frogs. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they begin to die. All of them. At once, the croaking stops, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the sound of millions of small bodies hitting the ground as they fall from walls, furniture, and trees. Now instead of living frogs covering everything, you have dead frogs covering everything. The cleanup is impossible. There are too many bodies to bury or burn. You shovel them into piles, but the piles are enormous, some as tall as your house. The smell of decomposition fills the air for weeks. Disease spreads from the rotting carcasses. Flies multiply in numbers that defy imagination, feeding on the endless supply of dead frogs. Just when you think the worst is over, when you've finally cleaned most of the dead frogs from your house, and the smell is beginning to fade, the third judgment arrives. This time, there's no dramatic moment, no clear beginning. You just notice that you're itching, constantly. Your skin feels like it's crawling with tiny insects, too small to see clearly, but definitely there. You scratch until you bleed, but the itching doesn't stop. It gets worse. Soon you realize that every grain of dust in Egypt has become a living insect. Gnats so small they can barely be seen individually, but present in such incredible numbers that they form clouds. They get in your eyes, your nose, your mouth. When you breathe, you inhale them. When you eat, you swallow them. When you try to sleep, they crawl across your skin in endless, maddening streams. There's no escape from them. They penetrate the finest cloth, slip through the smallest cracks, find their way into every space where humans live. Your animals go crazy, rolling on the ground, shaking their heads frantically, trying to escape the torment of billions of tiny insects, crawling through their fur and into their ears. The gnats don't just irritate, they bite. Constantly. Your skin becomes covered with tiny red welts that itch beyond endurance. Scratching brings no relief, only more bleeding and more opportunities for infection. Children cry until they have no tears left, their small bodies covered with bites and scratches. Work becomes impossible. How can you farm when every handful of soil releases clouds of insects? How can you craft pottery when the clay writhers with gnats? How can you cook when every piece of food is contaminated with tiny bugs? The very act of living becomes torture. The Egyptian magicians try to replicate this plague, as they did with the blood and the frogs. But they fail. Completely. For the first time, their power meets something greater. Jannes and Jambres stand before Pharaoh, their faces grim, and speak words that will echo through history. This is the finger of God. The finger of God. Not the full hand, not the mighty arm, just the finger. A casual gesture from a deity so powerful that Egypt's greatest sorcerers can't even comprehend his methods, let alone replicate them. Your gods, your magic, your entire understanding of how the supernatural world works has just been revealed as inadequate. But Pharaoh's heart remains hard. 3 plagues have devastated his kingdom, but he will not release the Hebrew slaves. Perhaps he believes this is temporary. Perhaps he thinks his gods will eventually triumph. Perhaps his pride simply cannot accept defeat from a people he considers inferior. You lie in your bed tonight, your skin covered with gnat bites, the air still thick, with insects too small to see, but impossible to ignore. The smell of dead frogs still lingers despite weeks of cleanup. Your water tastes clean now, but you remember too clearly the week when the Nile ran red with blood. 3 times, the God of the Hebrews has demonstrated power beyond anything Egypt has ever seen. 3 times, your civilization's wisdom and magic have proven inadequate. But somehow, you know this is just the beginning. Something in the air, in the way Moses looked at Pharaoh, in the quiet confidence of the Hebrew slaves, tells you that these three judgments are merely a warning. The finger of God has touched Egypt. Soon, you'll discover what happens when he uses his whole hand. You thought the gnats were unbearable. You were wrong. The fourth judgment arrives on a morning that starts deceptively normal. The Nile runs clear. The gnats have finally diminished to tolerable levels, and for a brief moment you allow yourself to hope that perhaps the worst is over. Perhaps your gods have finally intervened. Perhaps this unknown Hebrew deity has made his point and moved on. Then you hear the buzzing. At first, it sounds like a distant storm, a low rumble from the horizon that makes you look up at a cloudless sky in confusion. But the sound grows louder, closer, more distinct. Not thunder, not wind. Millions upon millions of wings beating in unison, creating a drone that vibrates through your bones and makes your teeth ache. The flies arrive as a living black cloud that darkens the sun. Not the small gnats that tormented you for weeks, but massive swarms of every flying insect imaginable. House flies thick as your thumb. Biting flies with jaws that tear flesh. Wasps and hornets in numbers that defy belief. Flying beetles that crash into your face with the force of thrown stones. The swarm descends on your neighborhood like a localized apocalypse. The air becomes unbreathable, thick with insect bodies that fill your mouth and nose when you try to inhale. The buzzing is so loud you can't hear your own thoughts, let alone hold a conversation. Children disappear into their houses, but the insects pour through every crack, every gap, every opening that allows even the smallest amount of light. Within hours, your home becomes uninhabitable. Flies cover every surface in layers several inches deep. They contaminate every piece of food, every drop of water, every clean surface you've managed to maintain. The walls appear to move and breathe as millions of insects crawl over them in endless streams. Sleep becomes impossible as flies crawl across your face, into your ears, under your clothing. But the real horror isn't the discomfort, it's what the flies bring with them. Disease. The insects have been feeding on the piles of dead frogs that still rot throughout Egypt, and now they carry that contamination into your home, your food, your life. Every surface they touch becomes a potential source of infection. Every bite risks introducing toxins into your bloodstream. Your neighbors begin falling ill. First, stomach ailments from contaminated food. Then festering wounds where fly bites become infected. Fever spreads through households as immune systems, already weakened by weeks of stress and poor nutrition, fail to cope with the bacterial assault carried by billions of disease. Bearing insects. The economic impact becomes catastrophic almost immediately. Markets close because food cannot be sold when it's covered with layers of flies. Craftsmen cannot work when their tools and materials are contaminated. Transport stops because no one can travel through the insect clouds without risking suffocation. The sophisticated trade networks that connect Egypt to the rest of the ancient world grind to a halt. Your carefully stored grain becomes inedible, not just from fly contamination, but from the maggots that appear overnight in previously clean storage areas. Bread becomes impossible to bake when every oven fills with insects that die in the heat, creating a nauseating smell that makes the bread inedible, even if you could somehow remove all the insect bodies. But strangest of all, you notice that the Hebrew quarter of the city remains clear. The same God who sent these plagues apparently protects his people from their effects. You can see the distinct boundary, a line you could walk across in 30 seconds, that separates the Egyptian areas swarming with insects from the Hebrew areas where the air remains clear and children play outside without fear. This geographical discrimination troubles you more than the insects themselves. It suggests intelligence behind these judgments, intentionality rather than random natural disaster. Someone or something is specifically targeting Egypt while protecting the Hebrews. The implications are terrifying. After 7 days that feel like 7 years, the insects leave as suddenly as they arrived. The air clears, the buzzing fades, and you can finally breathe without inhaling flies. But the damage is done. Disease continues to spread from the contamination they left behind. The economy remains paralyzed, and everyone knows, with a certainty that chills the blood, that this is not the end. Pharaoh's response remains defiant. He will not release the Hebrew slaves, will not acknowledge the power of their God, will not admit that Egypt's gods have proven inadequate. His heart, as Moses predicted, remains hard, so the fifth judgment comes. You wake up to silence. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but the wrong kind of silence. The sounds that should be there. Cattle lowing in the fields, donkeys braying in the streets, goats bleating in their pens are absent. Completely absent. When you walk outside to investigate, you find them. All of them. Every cow, every bull, every ox that pulls your plows and powers your economy. Every horse that draws your chariots and carries your soldiers. Every sheep that provides wool, and every goat that gives milk. Dead. All of them dead. Not sick, not dying, but dead. Overnight, without warning, without visible cause. Egypt's entire livestock population has simply stopped living. The animals that survived the blood, the frogs, the gnats, and the flies, creatures that seemed immune to the supernatural disasters that tormented only humans, have been wiped out in a single night. The sight is overwhelming. Fields full of dead cattle, their bodies bloated in the morning sun, streets blocked by the carcasses of donkeys and horses, pens full of dead, sheep piled on top of each other like discarded toys. The smell of death begins immediately and grows stronger by the hour as decomposition accelerates in the desert heat. But again, the Hebrew livestock remains alive. Their cattle graze peacefully in the same fields where Egyptian animals lie rotting. Their donkeys carry loads through streets where Egyptian beasts of burden have collapsed and died. The distinction is absolute, the protection complete, the message unmistakable. The economic catastrophe is immediate and total. Egypt's agriculture depends entirely on animal power. Oxen pull the plows that turn the soil. Donkeys carry grain from the fields to storage facilities. Cattle provide milk, meat, and leather. Horses power the military machine that maintains order and protects trade routes. Without animals, farming becomes impossible. The fields of grain that survived the earlier plagues cannot be harvested because there are no oxen to pull the harvest equipment. The irrigation systems that distribute Nile water throughout the agricultural regions cannot be maintained. because there are no animals to power the pumps and carry the materials. Food becomes scarce almost immediately. Egypt has always maintained large stores of grain against the possibility of poor flood years. But those stores cannot be accessed without animal transport. Granaries full of wheat and barley sit unused because there's no way to move their contents to where people need food. The military implications are equally dire. Egyptian power depends on horse-drawn chariots that can outmaneuver and overwhelm infantry forces. Without horses, Egypt's military advantage disappears overnight. The empire that has dominated the ancient world through superior mobility and tactics is suddenly reduced to foot soldiers with bronze weapons. Trade collapses entirely. The caravans that carry goods between Egypt and other nations depend on donkeys and camels to transport merchandise across desert routes. Ships require animal power to load and unload cargo at ports. The commercial networks that made Egypt wealthy simply stop functioning. You watch your neighbors attempting to drag plows through fields by hand, trying to accomplish with human muscle what had always required animal strength. The work is backbreaking and inefficient. A day's labor by an ox team becomes a week's work for a group of men, if it can be accomplished at all. The disposal of dead animals becomes a public health crisis. There are simply too many carcasses to bury or burn. They pile up in the streets, in the fields, around houses, creating breeding grounds for disease and attracting scavengers that spread contamination even further. Children ask their parents why their pet goat won't wake up, why the family cow lies still in the pasture, why the donkey that carried them to market yesterday will never move again. There are no answers that make sense within Egyptian understanding of how the world works. But before you can even begin to process the magnitude of this economic and social collapse, the sixth judgment arrives. It starts as an itch, just a small irritation on your arm that you scratch absently while trying to figure out how to clear dead animals from your property. But the itch doesn't go away. It gets worse, much worse. Within hours, the small irritation becomes a burning sensation, then a painful swelling, then an open sore that oozes pus and refuses to heal. And it's not just you. Everyone in Egypt is developing the same symptoms simultaneously. The boils start small but grow rapidly, spreading across skin like wildfire across dry grass. They appear on arms, legs, torsos, faces. Nowhere is spared. The sores are deep, penetrating to muscle tissue, filled with infection that seems to generate its own heat. Touching them brings agony, but leaving them alone brings no relief. Your face swells until your eyes are nearly closed. Your hands become so covered with boils that you can't grip tools or feed yourself without excruciating pain. Walking becomes torture as sores on your feet burst and reform with every step. Simple activities like eating, sleeping, or even sitting still become exercises in pain management. The infection spreads rapidly, turning minor boils into major wounds that refuse to heal. Pus flows constantly, soaking through whatever cloth you use as bandages and creating a smell of infection that follows you everywhere. Fever sets in as your body tries to fight the systemic infection, but the boils keep spreading faster than your immune system can respond. Medical treatment proves useless. Egyptian physicians, the most advanced in the ancient world, have no cure for supernatural affliction. Their herbal remedies and surgical techniques, sophisticated enough to treat normal diseases and injuries, provide no relief from divinely imposed suffering. Even the magicians who serve Pharaoh are affected. Jans and Jambres, who managed to replicate the first 2 plagues before admitting defeat, are so covered with boils they cannot stand before the king. The men who claimed magical power, equal to Moses, now lie writhing in pain, unable even to attempt their illusions. Work becomes impossible. How can you plow fields when touching the plow handle causes agony? How can you craft pottery when your hands are masses of infected sores? How can you prepare food when every movement sends waves of pain through your body? Egyptian society, already crippled by the death of its animals, now faces the additional burden of a population too sick to function. The psychological impact proves as devastating as the physical suffering. These aren't random boils that might be explained by poor sanitation or dietary problems. They appeared simultaneously on every Egyptian, young and old, healthy and sick, rich and poor. The supernatural origin is undeniable, the targeting specific and intentional. And once again, the Hebrews remain untouched. While you writhe in agony, Hebrew children play in the streets with clear, healthy skin, while Egyptian adults lie moaning on their beds. Hebrew workers continue their tasks, unaffected by the plague that torments their masters. The contrast is deliberate and unmistakable. The God of the Hebrews demonstrates his ability to distinguish between his people and their oppressors with surgical precision. He can afflict the Egyptians while standing in the same room protecting the Hebrews. The implications terrify you more than the pain. You lie on your bed at night, your skin on fire with infection, your body weak from fever, and you begin to understand that you're not experiencing random natural disasters. You're witnessing a systematic demonstration of power by a deity whose abilities dwarf anything in the Egyptian pantheon. Each plague has been more severe than the last. Each has proven Egyptian magic inadequate, and each has shown this unknown god's complete control over the natural world. But you also sense that these 6 plagues, devastating as they've been, are still just preparation. The water turned to blood attacked Egypt's most basic need. The frogs and insects made life uncomfortable and disease-ridden. The flies brought contamination and economic disruption. The death of livestock crippled agriculture and trade. The boils incapacitated the population. But no one has died yet, not directly. The plagues have been progressively more severe, but they've stopped short of mass casualties. You have the terrifying suspicion that this restraint is intentional, that something much worse is being held in reserve. Through your pain and fever, you hear rumors from the palace. Moses has appeared before Pharaoh again, his demand unchanged. Let my people go. But he's also delivered a warning about what comes next, if the answer remains no. Weather unlike anything Egypt has ever experienced. Hail mixed with fire. Destruction that will make the previous plagues seem like minor inconveniences. Your skin burns with infection. Your livestock lies rotting in the fields. Your economy has collapsed. And your understanding of divine power has been shattered. But somehow you know that your suffering has only begun. The God of the Hebrews isn't finished with Egypt. He's barely started. The warning comes at dawn. Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh one more time. their message now carrying a weight that makes even the palace guards step backward. The previous plagues were demonstrations. They explain. Proofs of power. Invitations to acknowledge the true God and release his people. What comes next will be different. What comes next will be destruction on a scale that Egypt has never imagined. Tomorrow, at this time, Moses declares, "The Lord will send a hailstorm more severe than any that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded until now." He pauses, letting the words sink into the stunned silence of the throne room. "Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die." You hear these words repeated throughout the city as messengers carry the warning to every district, every neighborhood, every household. For the first time, the Hebrew God is offering protection to Egyptians, not mercy protection. If you believe the warning and act on it, you might survive what's coming. If you don't, you'll die. The choice divides Egypt in a way that none of the previous plagues managed. Some people, terrified by 6 demonstrations of supernatural power, rush to bring whatever animals survived the 5th plague into shelters. They board up windows, reinforce roofs, and huddle indoors with their families. Others, still loyal to Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods, leave their remaining livestock in the fields and go about their normal business. You find yourself torn between disbelief and terror. Hail in Egypt is rare and usually minor, small ice pellets that melt quickly in the desert heat. But after everything you've witnessed, after 6 impossible plagues that shattered every assumption about how the world works, can you afford to ignore this warning? The sky that morning looks deceptively normal. Clear blue stretching to every horizon, with the sun rising on schedule through dry air that promises another typical Egyptian day. No clouds, no wind, no hint of the promised storm. Some of your neighbors point to the peaceful sky and laugh at those who spent the night moving animals and securing their homes. But you remember how normal the morning looked before each previous plague struck. The Nile appeared pristine before it turned to blood. The air seemed clean before frogs filled every space. The ground looked ordinary before gnats emerged from every grain of dust. You've learned not to trust normal appearances in Egypt anymore. By midday, the first clouds appear on the western horizon. Small at first, white and innocent looking. But they grow with unnatural speed, darkening as they expand, reaching heights that make them visible from hundreds of miles away. The temperature drops, something that never happens in Egypt during the day. Cold air that makes you shiver despite the desert heat that has always defined your world. The clouds continue building, rising into towering columns that block out more and more of the sun. The temperature keeps falling until you need the heavy robes, usually reserved for cool winter nights. Children point at the sky in amazement, having never seen anything like the massive storm system forming above their heads. Then the wind starts. Not the gentle breezes that usually blow along the Nile, but violent gusts that tear at your clothing and fill the air with dust and debris. Trees that have stood for decades bend nearly to the ground. Loose objects become projectiles that crash through windows and knock people off their feet. The first hailstones fall just as the sun disappears completely behind clouds so dark they turn day into twilight. These aren't the tiny ice pellets you might have expected. They're massive chunks of ice, some as large as your fist, falling with enough force to crack stone and shatter bone. The sound is indescribable. Thousands of ice boulders hitting roofs, streets, and anything else in their path create a constant crashing that drowns out all other noise. You can't hear yourself think, can't communicate with family members in the same room, can't do anything but huddle against the walls and pray that your roof will hold. But the hail is only part of the horror. Mixed with the ice comes fire, not lightning, but actual flames that burn even as they fall with the hail. Fire that doesn't go out when it hits the wet ground, that spreads despite being surrounded by melting ice. That turns the storm into a supernatural fusion of opposing elements that shouldn't be able to exist together. Through the small gaps in your window coverings, you watch your neighborhood being systematically destroyed. Hailstones punch holes through roofs, collapse walls, and turn streets into rivers of ice and debris. The fire burns everything: organic trees, crops, wooden structures, even the bodies of any animals or people caught in the open. Those who ignored the warning and left livestock in the fields watch helplessly as their animals are battered to death by ice chunks that fall like artillery shells. The few people caught outside when the storm began are killed instantly, their bodies broken by impacts that no human could survive. Your carefully tended garden, the source of vegetables that supplemented your grain-based diet, disappears under the assault. Every plant is either crushed by hail or burned by the supernatural fire. Fruit trees that took years to grow are reduced to shattered stumps in minutes. The barley and wheat fields that survived the earlier plagues are completely destroyed, their stalks cut down as if by giant scythes. The storm continues for hours. Hours of constant bombardment that tests every building in Egypt to its breaking point. Houses collapse under the weight of accumulated hail. Roofs cave in, trapping families under tons of ice and debris. The fire spreads through neighborhoods, consuming everything combustible, despite the wet conditions that should have prevented any flame from taking hold. When the hail finally stops, Egypt looks like a battlefield. The ground lies covered with ice chunks 3 feet deep in some places. Every tree has been stripped of leaves and bark, leaving skeletal remains that look like monuments to destruction. Buildings that survived are damaged, their walls cracked and roofs partially caved in. But the human cost is what truly devastates you. Bodies lie scattered throughout the areas where people ignored the warning or couldn't find adequate shelter. Crushed by hail, burned by supernatural fire, or trapped under collapsed buildings. The death toll mounts as rescue efforts begin, revealing the true price of underestimating the Hebrew God's power. The economic destruction is total and immediate. Every crop in Egypt has been destroyed. The barley that was nearly ready for harvest, the wheat that would have fed the nation for another year, the fruit trees that provided vitamins and trade goods. All gone. Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, now faces starvation. The livestock that survived the 5th plague and the owners who heeded the warning are the only animals left alive in the entire kingdom. with most of the animal population already dead, and the survivors reduced to a tiny fraction of what existed before the plagues began. Egypt's agricultural capacity has been reduced to subsistence level, but Pharaoh's heart remains hardened. Despite watching his kingdom systematically destroyed, despite seeing his people killed by supernatural forces, despite the obvious inadequacy of Egyptian magic against the Hebrew God, he refuses to release the slaves. His advisors beg him to reconsider, pointing out that Egypt is already ruined. But pride, or perhaps divine manipulation of his decision-making process, keeps him defiant. So Moses returns with another warning. If you refuse to let my people go, he tells Pharaoh, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your country. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. Locusts. In the ancient world, few things inspire more terror than a locust swarm. These aren't individual insects that can be swatted away, but massive clouds of eating machines that can strip entire regions bare of vegetation in a matter of hours. Egypt has experienced locust swarms before, but always relatively small ones that damaged crops, but didn't threaten the entire food supply. What Moses promises is different. Not a natural swarm that might consume part of this year's harvest, but a supernatural invasion that will eat everything green that survived the hail. Every blade of grass, every surviving tree, every garden plant, every weed. Total biological devastation that will leave Egypt as barren as the surrounding desert. Even Pharaoh's advisors finally break ranks. How long will this man be a snare to us? They demand. Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? For the first time, the royal court openly challenges Pharaoh's decisions, recognizing that continued defiance means national suicide. But when Moses and Aaron return for negotiations, Pharaoh tries to bargain. He'll release the men to worship in the desert, but the women and children must stay as insurance for their return. Moses refuses. All the Hebrew people must be freed, along with their livestock, with no conditions and no guarantees of return. The negotiation fails. Pharaoh's final answer remains no. The next morning brings a wind unlike anything Egypt has ever experienced. Not the violent gusts that accompanied the hailstorm, but a steady, warm breeze from the east that carries with it an ominous darkness on the horizon. At first, it looks like a sandstorm, the kind that occasionally blows in from the desert and covers everything with fine dust. But as the darkness approaches, you realize it's not sand, it's movement. Billions upon billions of individual insects, creating a cloud so vast it blocks out the sun. The sound reaches you before the swarm does, a humming, rustling, clicking noise that grows louder and more complex as the mass of locusts draws closer. When the swarm arrives, it defies comprehension. The locusts don't just land, they descend like a living avalanche, covering every surface with layers of hungry insects, several feet deep. The ground disappears under the writhing mass of brown and yellow bodies. Trees vanish completely as locusts pile on top of each other to reach every leaf and twig. The eating begins immediately. Millions of jaws, working in perfect synchronization, stripping vegetation with mechanical efficiency. The sound is like a massive fire crackling through dry wood. But instead of flames consuming fuel, it's insects consuming everything green in Egypt. You watch in fascination and horror as your neighbor's surviving date palm disappears. First the leaves vanish, eaten down to the bare fronds. Then the bark is stripped away as the locusts devour every bit of organic matter they can reach. Within an hour, nothing remains but a bare wooden pole that will never grow again. The swarm moves methodically through your area, leaving behind landscape that looks like it's been scrubbed clean by some impossible force. Grass disappears completely, leaving only bare dirt. Bushes are reduced to naked stems. Even weeds growing in cracks between stones are found and consumed. The few crops that survived the hail are eliminated in minutes. Grain fields that represented months of labor, and the only hope for avoiding famine, are reduced to stubble, then to nothing at all. Garden vegetables, fruit trees, even the small medicinal plants that Egyptian doctors used to prepare their treatments, all gone. But the locusts don't stop with outdoor vegetation. They find their way into houses, storage buildings, and anywhere else that might contain organic matter. They eat wooden furniture, cloth made from plant fibers, scrolls made from papyrus, and even leather goods. Anything that was once alive becomes food for the insatiable swarm. The psychological impact proves as devastating as the physical destruction. You stand in your doorway, watching your world being systematically erased, and realize that you're witnessing the end of Egypt as a civilization. Without vegetation, there can be no agriculture. Without agriculture, there can be no food. Without food, there can be no people. The economic implications are immediate and final. Egypt's wealth has always been based on agricultural surplus that could be traded for manufactured goods, precious metals, and exotic materials from other regions. A country that can't feed its own people has nothing to offer in international trade. Egypt is about to become a barren wasteland that other nations will avoid rather than seek out. The locust swarm continues for days, methodically consuming every trace of plant life from one end of Egypt to the other. When they finally leave, flying away as suddenly and completely as they arrived, they leave behind a landscape that looks like the surface of the moon. Brown, bare, lifeless. Nothing green remains anywhere in the entire kingdom. You walk through areas that were once gardens, orchards, and grain fields, and find only empty dirt. The trees that provided shade and fruit are dead wooden skeletons. The grass that once cushioned your steps is gone, leaving hard, packed earth that will grow nothing without seeds that no longer exist. Children ask their parents when the plants will grow back, not understanding that there are no seeds left to sprout, no roots left to regenerate, no hope for agricultural recovery without massive imports of plant material from other countries. Countries that Egypt no longer has the wealth to trade with. The few animals that survived the earlier plagues begin to starve immediately. There's no grass for grazing, no grain for feeding, no vegetation of any kind. Pet animals, work animals, and the small breeding stock that represented hope for rebuilding Egypt's livestock population face death by starvation within days. But perhaps most terrifying of all is the silence. Egypt without vegetation is Egypt without the sounds of life. No rustling leaves, no buzzing insects, no birds singing in trees that no longer exist. The acoustic landscape becomes as barren as the physical one, creating an eerie quiet that makes every human sound seem unnaturally loud and isolated. You lie in your bed that night, listening to the unnatural silence outside, and finally understand that you've been witnessing something far more significant than a series of natural disasters. This has been a systematic demonstration of power by a deity who claims authority over every aspect of the natural world. Water, amphibians, insects, weather, disease, fire, and biological systems all bend to his will with precision that no Egyptian god has ever displayed. 8 plagues have reduced the mightiest civilization on earth to a starving, devastated shell of its former glory. And somehow you know that the worst is yet to come. 8 plagues have passed through Egypt like the fingers of destruction, each one more devastating than the last. Your kingdom lies in ruins. Crops destroyed, livestock dead, people sick and starving, the very landscape stripped bare of life. But somehow, you sense that everything you've endured so far has been preparation for something worse. Something that will make the previous horrors seem like gentle warnings. The feeling starts as an unease you can't quite identify. A wrongness in the air that has nothing to do with the smell of death and destruction that's become Egypt's constant atmosphere. The sky looks normal, clear blue stretching endlessly overhead, unmarked by the clouds that brought hail and fire. The wind feels ordinary, carrying the familiar scents of the Nile and the dust of ancient stones. But underneath the normal sensory input, something fundamental has changed. You first notice it in the quality of light. The sun rises, as it always has, following its eternal path across the Egyptian sky, but the illumination seems somehow different. Not dimmer exactly, but less substantial. Shadows appear sharper, darkness seems deeper, and the contrast between light and shadow becomes more pronounced, as if the world is slowly adjusting its visual settings in preparation for something unprecedented. The animals sense it first. The few surviving creatures, the livestock that was sheltered during the hail, the pets that managed to find food despite the locust devastation, begin acting strangely. Dogs pace restlessly, whining without apparent cause. Cats hide in the darkest corners they can find and refuse to come out even for food. Birds that normally fill the dawn hours with song remain silent, huddled motionless on their perches. Your neighbours feel it too, though none of you can articulate exactly what's wrong. Conversations become subdued, even whispered, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of whatever malevolent force is gathering strength. Children stay close to their parents, clinging to familiar adults with an intensity that suggests instinctive awareness of approaching danger. Sleep becomes difficult, then impossible. You lie on your mat, listening to the unnatural quiet of an Egypt stripped of vegetation and most of its animal life, but the silence itself seems to pulse with threatening energy. Every small sound, the settling of your house, the distant murmur of neighbours talking in hushed tones, the occasional cry of a baby, seems amplified and ominous. The psychological pressure builds, gradually but relentlessly. Days pass without any obvious supernatural intervention, but the sense of impending catastrophe grows stronger. You find yourself checking and rechecking your food supplies, your water stores, your shelter preparations, driven by an anxiety you can't rationally explain. Then, 3 days before the promised plague, Moses appears in the palace one final time. His message is simple, direct, and more terrifying than any threat Egypt has yet heard. This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her hand mill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. The words spread through Egypt like wildfire, carried by palace servants, repeated by merchants, whispered by mothers as they look at their sleeping children. Every firstborn son will die. Not might die, not could die if certain conditions aren't met. Will die. A divine death sentence pronounced on an entire category of Egyptian humanity. For the first time since the plagues began, the threat is not against property, comfort, or even general health. This is a promise of targeted killing, precise and unavoidable. The Hebrew God, who has demonstrated absolute control over water, animals, insects, weather, and vegetation, now declares his intention to claim human lives with the same surgical precision he's shown in every previous judgment. The specificity of the threat makes it even more terrifying. Not all children, not random deaths, but firstborn sons. The heirs, the inheritors, the children who carry family names and bloodlines into the future. The sons who represent continuity, legacy, and hope for every Egyptian household. The deaths that would cause maximum psychological and social devastation. Parents throughout Egypt enter a state of frantic denial and desperate preparation. Some refuse to believe that any god, even one who has displayed such devastating power, would actually kill children. Others begin elaborate rituals and sacrifices to Egyptian gods, begging for protection that their deities have proven incapable of providing. A few consider the instructions Moses gave to the Hebrew families, something about blood on doorframes and a special meal eaten in haste. But most Egyptians don't know about those instructions. And those who hear fragments of information don't understand their significance. The protection offered to the Hebrews isn't extended to their oppressors. For 8 plagues, you've watched the Hebrew quarter remain untouched while Egyptian areas suffered. This time, that pattern promises to become a matter of life and death. The 3 days of waiting become an eternity of terror. Firstborn sons throughout Egypt become the focus of obsessive attention and desperate protection efforts. Parents keep their eldest boys inside, surround them with guards, move them between locations, try every strategy they can imagine to somehow evade a supernatural death sentence. You watch your neighbors, attempts at protection with a mixture of sympathy and horror. Mothers who haven't slept since Moses' announcement. Fathers who pace their houses like caged animals. Siblings who suddenly understand that their family structure might be permanently altered by midnight on the appointed day. The psychological toll extends beyond families with firstborn sons. Everyone understands that they're witnessing the final demonstration of a power that has systematically destroyed their civilization. If the Hebrew God can kill specific categories of people with the same precision he's shown in manipulating natural phenomena, then no one in Egypt is truly safe. Today it's firstborn sons. Tomorrow it could be anyone. The waiting becomes unbearable, as the sun sets on the appointed day. Families huddle together, marking time by the movement of shadows, calculating how many hours remain until midnight. Some try to stay awake, as if consciousness might somehow protect their children. Others attempt to sleep, hoping that unconsciousness will allow them to avoid witnessing whatever horror is about to unfold. Throughout the Hebrew quarter, a different kind of preparation takes place. Families follow precise instructions passed down from Moses and Aaron, painting lamb's blood on their door frames and eating a meal of roasted lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs while dressed for travel. Their firstborn sons sleep peacefully, protected by obedience to specific commands from the God who has demonstrated his power to preserve life as easily as he destroys it. The contrast is stark and intentional. Egyptian parents sit awake in terror, helpless to protect their children from a threat they can't fight or flee. Hebrew parents follow ritual instructions with confidence, trusting in promises from a God who has never failed to keep his word, either for judgment or protection. As darkness deepens and midnight approaches, the very air in Egypt seems to thicken with approaching catastrophe. The few surviving animals become completely silent, as if the natural world is holding its breath. Even the constant whisper of wind that usually provides background sound to Egyptian nights disappears, leaving a silence so complete it feels solid, oppressive, threatening. You find yourself counting heartbeats, measuring the passage of time by the rhythm of your own pulse. Every minute that passes brings the promised judgment closer. Every shadow that shifts as the moon moves across the sky marks another increment toward an appointment with divine vengeance that no Egyptian power can prevent or postpone. The temperature seems to drop as midnight approaches. Though the desert night isn't unusually cold, the chill comes from within, from the growing certainty that you're about to witness something that will change Egypt forever. Something that will make the previous 8 plagues seem like gentle preparation for the main event. Then, as palace water clocks mark the transition from one day to the next, as the moon reaches its midnight position directly overhead, as Egypt holds its collective breath in terror, the final plague begins. It starts without sound, without visible manifestation, without any obvious supernatural display. One moment, firstborn sons throughout Egypt are sleeping peacefully in their beds, breathing regularly, dreaming ordinary dreams. The next moment, they simply stop breathing, stop living, stop existing as anything other than small, still bodies that will never wake up. The silence breaks as the first scream pierces the night, then another, then dozens, hundreds, thousands of voices crying out in anguish as parents discover that their eldest sons have died quietly, peacefully, without struggle or pain, but completely and irreversibly. The sound that rises from Egypt that night is unlike anything the world has ever heard. Not the screams of people facing immediate physical danger, but the wails of sudden, incomprehensible loss. The voices of parents discovering that their children are gone, that their families have been broken, that their futures have been erased by a power they cannot fight or comprehend. In the palace, Pharaoh's own firstborn son lies dead, the heir to the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, protected by the finest guards and the most sophisticated security, killed as easily as the firstborn son of the poorest slave. Divine power that recognizes no human authority, respects no earthly protection, acknowledges no distinction between royal and common blood. The crying spreads through every district, every neighborhood, every household that contains a firstborn son, rich and poor, young and old, healthy and sick. The selection is random except for the single criterion that determines life and death. Birth order becomes destiny, as the God of the Hebrews demonstrates. His ability to distinguish between categories of people with absolute precision. But in the Hebrew quarter, silence prevails. Behind doors marked with lamb's blood, firstborn Hebrew sons sleep safely through the night that brings death to their Egyptian counterparts. The protection promised to Abraham's descendants proves, as reliable as the judgments, threatened against their oppressors. The geographical precision is perfect and terrifying. Egyptian houses suffer loss, while Hebrew houses remain untouched. Even when they're located on the same street, separated by nothing more than a few yards of distance, and the presence or absence of blood on the doorframe. You stumble through the streets in the hours after midnight, trying to comprehend the scope of what has happened. Every Egyptian household you pass shows signs of loss, wailing voices, gathered crowds, the unmistakable sounds of sudden grief. The firstborn sons, who went to sleep as normal children, have become corpses that parents refuse to believe are really dead. The economic and social implications become clear immediately. Firstborn sons in Egyptian society aren't just children, they're heirs, inheritors, the next generation of leadership. Their deaths represent the decapitation of Egypt's future. The elimination of an entire generation of men who were expected to continue family businesses, inherit property, and maintain social structures, trades and crafts that depend on father to son knowledge transfer face extinction. Family wealth that was supposed to pass to eldest sons now has no clear destination. Political positions that were inherited through primogeniture suddenly lack obvious successors. The social order that has maintained Egyptian stability for centuries crumbles in a single night. But beyond the practical consequences, the psychological impact proves devastating in ways that Egypt will never fully recover from. The systematic killing of firstborn sons demonstrates that the Hebrew God can reach into any home, bypass any protection, and take any life he chooses. No one in Egypt is safe from a deity who has proven his ability to kill with precision that surpasses any human weapon or strategy. The message is unmistakable and final. Egypt's gods are powerless. Egypt's magic is worthless. And Egypt's pride has been completely shattered by a people they considered inferior slaves. The civilization that thought itself the pinnacle of human achievement has been reduced to a broken, grieving nation that can offer no resistance to demands from the God who has systematically destroyed everything they valued. As dawn breaks over Egypt, revealing the full scope of the devastation, Pharaoh finally breaks. The king who resisted 8 previous plagues, who maintained his defiance despite watching his kingdom collapse around him, who refused to acknowledge any authority higher than his own divine status, now sends messengers racing through the streets with a desperate plea: find Moses and Aaron immediately, and tell them they can take their people and leave. The sound that rises from Egypt in the hours after midnight is unlike anything the world has ever heard before or will ever hear again. Not the screams of people facing immediate physical danger, but something deeper, more primal, the collective wailing of a civilization that has just watched its future die in a single night. The voices of 10,000 households discovering that their firstborn sons have simply stopped breathing, stopped living, stopped existing as anything other than small, still bodies that will never wake up. You stumble through the streets as dawn approaches, trying to comprehend the scope of what has happened around you. Every Egyptian house you pass shows the same scene of incomprehensible loss. Mothers clutching bodies that are already growing cold, fathers standing in doorways with expressions of shock so complete they seem carved from stone, siblings trying to shake brothers who will never respond again. The geographical precision of the judgment is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. Egyptian houses suffer the loss of their firstborn, while Hebrew houses, sometimes located on the same street, remain completely untouched. You can walk down a single road and witness the supernatural selectivity house by house. Egyptian families wailing in grief. Hebrew families quietly preparing for departure, separated by nothing more than a few yards of distance and the presence or absence of blood on doorframes. In the palace, Pharaoh discovers that divine power recognizes no human authority and respects no earthly protection. His own firstborn son, the heir to the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, lies dead despite being guarded by the finest soldiers and protected by the most sophisticated security Egypt can provide. The future pharaoh, trained from birth to rule the known world, has been killed as easily as the firstborn son of the poorest slave working in the mud pits. The king who has resisted 8 previous plagues, who maintained his defiance despite watching his kingdom systematically destroyed, who refused to acknowledge any authority higher than his own supposed divine status, finally breaks completely. The death of his son shatters something fundamental in Pharaoh's psyche, not just his grief as a father, but his entire understanding of power, divinity, and his place in the cosmic order. Royal messengers race through the streets of Memphis with unprecedented urgency, their voices hoarse from shouting the same desperate message. Find Moses and Aaron immediately! The king commands it! Find them now? The same Pharaoh who previously demanded that the Hebrew leaders come to him now sends his servants scrambling through the city to locate and plead with men he had treated as inferior foreign troublemakers. When the messengers find Moses and Aaron in the Hebrew quarter, where families are calmly making final preparations for departure, Pharaoh's message represents the complete capitulation of Egyptian power. Up! Leave my people, you and the Israelites! Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go, and also bless me. The transformation is stunning and complete. The Pharaoh, who had demanded increased labor from Hebrew slaves, who had refused every previous request for their release, who had hardened his heart against supernatural demonstrations of power, now begs the very people he had oppressed to leave his kingdom and invoke blessings from their God. The blessing request reveals Pharaoh's complete understanding that the Hebrew God possesses power beyond anything Egypt can match or resist. But the message goes further than simple permission to leave. Egyptian officials, their own families devastated by the night's losses, actively urged the Hebrews to depart as quickly as possible. "We will all be dead," they cry, recognizing that further delay might bring additional judgments that Egypt simply cannot survive. The people who had once benefited from Hebrew slave labor now view their continued presence as an existential threat to Egyptian survival. The Hebrew response demonstrates preparation that goes far beyond the single night's warning. These people have been ready to leave Egypt for weeks. Their belongings packed, their livestock gathered, their travel arrangements planned down to the smallest detail. What looks like sudden departure to panicked Egyptians is actually the culmination of careful preparation by people who knew this moment would come. But the most shocking aspect of the Exodus is what happens next. Egyptians, desperate to speed the Hebrew departure and terrified of provoking additional divine wrath, begin pressing valuable gifts into Hebrew hands. Gold jewelry, silver ornaments, fine clothing, precious objects that represent the accumulated wealth of Egyptian households, all freely given to people who had been slaves just hours earlier. You watch your neighbors approaching Hebrew families with treasures they would normally guard jealously, begging them to accept these gifts and leave immediately. The psychological reversal is complete and surreal. The masters are now pleading with their former slaves, offering bribes for rapid departure, treating people they had previously considered property as honored guests who must be satisfied and sent away quickly. The economic implications are staggering. Egypt, already devastated by crop failures and livestock deaths, is now voluntarily transferring its remaining wealth to departing slaves. The jewelry and precious objects that Egyptian families saved through generations of prosperity are being given away in a desperate attempt to appease the God who has proven his ability to destroy anything Egyptian while protecting anything Hebrew. Hebrew families accept these gifts with quiet dignity, neither gloating over their former oppressor's desperation nor refusing offerings that their God has clearly provided as compensation for generations of unpaid labor. The wealth transfer represents divine justice, Egypt paying retroactively for the work performed by Hebrew slaves who had built the monuments, constructed the cities, and maintained the agricultural systems that made Egyptian prosperity possible. As the Hebrew families gather in the central areas of their districts, their organization becomes apparent. This isn't a chaotic flight by desperate refugees, but an orderly departure by people following a carefully planned exodus strategy. Families group together by tribes. Livestock is organized for efficient movement. Supplies are distributed according to predetermined arrangements. The numbers are overwhelming when you finally see them assembled together. Not just a few thousand people, but hundreds of thousands. Men, women, children, and elderly people representing 12 tribes descended from Jacob's sons. Livestock that survived the plagues because of divine protection. Carts loaded with possessions and supplies for a journey whose destination remains mysterious to Egyptian observers. Moses and Aaron move through the gathering crowds, providing final instructions, ensuring that everyone understands the departure procedures, coordinating the logistics of moving what amounts to a small nation out of Egypt in a single day. Their authority is complete and unquestioned. These are the men who spoke for the God, who brought 10 plagues upon Egypt, and their words carry the weight of divine backing. The Hebrew families are not alone in their departure. A mixed multitude of non-Israelites chooses to leave Egypt with them. Slaves from other conquered nations, Egyptian servants who have witnessed the power of the Hebrew God and decided that staying in Egypt means staying in a cursed land, foreign workers who calculate that their chances for survival and prosperity are better with the people whose God has proven his ability to provide and protect. As the massive procession begins moving toward Egypt's borders, you realize you're witnessing the end of an era that has defined the ancient world for centuries. Egypt without Hebrew labor will be Egypt without the workforce that maintained its monuments, built its cities, and sustained its agricultural systems. The economic foundation of Egyptian civilization is walking away, never to return. The route they take is not the direct path toward Canaan that would minimize travel time, but a longer journey toward the Red Sea that serves strategic purposes only Moses and his God understand fully. The Hebrew departure is not desperate flight, but strategic relocation, guided by divine intelligence that has outmaneuvered Egyptian power at every step of this conflict. Egyptian pursuit is unthinkable in the immediate aftermath of the final plague. The army is devastated by the loss of firstborn sons, including officers and trained soldiers whose deaths have disrupted military organization. The horses that survived earlier plagues are weak from lack of proper feed. After the locust devastation, the economic resources needed to supply a military campaign have been depleted by months of agricultural and commercial collapse. But beyond practical considerations, psychological factors make pursuit impossible in the short term. Egyptian confidence has been completely shattered by 10 supernatural demonstrations that their gods, their magic, and their military might are inadequate against the Hebrew God. No Egyptian soldier wants to chase people whose deity has proven his ability to kill with precision and protect with absolute effectiveness. You stand in the streets of your ruined city, watching the final Hebrew families disappear beyond the horizon, and realize that you're witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history. Not just the departure of a slave population, but the emergence of a nation whose God has demonstrated power that dwarfs anything the ancient world has previously seen. The silence that falls over Egypt after the Hebrew departure is more complete than anything you experienced during the plague of darkness. This isn't the temporary absence of light, but the permanent absence of hope. The workforce that built Egypt's greatness is gone. The wealth that sustained Egyptian prosperity has been transferred to departing slaves. The population that will rebuild Egyptian civilization must somehow do so without the firstborn sons, who were supposed to provide leadership and continuity. The psychological trauma extends far beyond individual grief for dead children. Every Egyptian now understands that their gods failed to protect them, their magic proved worthless against supernatural power, and their civilization's claim to superiority was false. The worldview that sustained Egyptian confidence for over 1,000 years has been systematically destroyed in less than a year. But perhaps most devastating of all is the recognition that this destruction was intentional, precise, and completely avoidable. The Hebrew God offered multiple opportunities for peaceful resolution, demonstrated his power through increasingly severe warnings, and provided clear instructions for avoiding the worst consequences. Egypt's suffering resulted not from divine caprice, but from stubborn refusal to acknowledge authority higher than Pharaoh's supposed godhood. The theological implications terrify thinking Egyptians more than the immediate practical problems. If the Hebrew God can override Egyptian deities, control natural phenomena with absolute precision, and protect his people while destroying their oppressors, then the entire Egyptian understanding of divine power and cosmic order is fundamentally wrong. Some Egyptians begin questioning whether they should abandon their traditional gods entirely and somehow seek the favor of the Hebrew deity. Others retreat into desperate denial, insisting that Egyptian gods will eventually triumph and restore Egypt's former glory. A few begin worshipping the Hebrew God while remaining in Egypt, creating the theological confusion that will complicate Egyptian religion for generations. The practical work of rebuilding begins immediately, but without adequate resources, population, or hope for rapid recovery. Fields must be replanted with seeds that don't exist, using draft animals that are mostly dead, by farmers whose firstborn sons will never inherit the family land. Cities must be maintained without the skilled craftsmen who died in the final plague or departed with the Hebrew Exodus. International relations shift immediately as neighboring kingdoms recognize that Egypt's power has been permanently broken. Trade partners who once courted Egyptian favor now treat Egypt as a minor regional power, barely capable of defending its own borders. Military enemies who previously feared Egyptian retaliation now consider whether Egypt's weakness makes invasion attractive and profitable. The psychological wounds prove even more difficult to heal than the physical devastation. Egyptian children grow up hearing stories about the year when their gods failed, their magic proved useless, and their supposedly superior civilization was humiliated by slaves whose god demonstrated power beyond Egyptian comprehension. Generational trauma becomes embedded in Egyptian culture as parents struggle to explain to surviving children why their brothers died, why their country was destroyed, and why their gods couldn't protect them from foreign deity who demanded justice for oppressed people. But in the Hebrew community, now somewhere in the desert between Egypt and their promised destination, the same events are remembered as the greatest demonstration of divine power and faithfulness in human history. The God who promised Abraham that his descendants would be numerous, blessed, and free has kept every commitment despite 4 centuries of slavery and oppression. The wealth they carry from Egypt, given freely by terrified former masters, provides resources for establishing their new nation. The unity forged through shared suffering and miraculous deliverance creates social cohesion that will sustain them through 40 years of desert wandering. The memory of divine power, demonstrated against the world's strongest empire, gives them confidence to face whatever challenges await in their promised land. As you lie in your bed in devastated Egypt, listening to the unnaturally quiet night, sounds of a broken civilization, you understand that you've witnessed something that will be remembered and studied for thousands of years. Not just a change in regional politics or economics, but a demonstration of divine power that redefined humanity's understanding of what's possible. When the creator of the universe chooses to intervene directly in human affairs, the Hebrew God didn't just defeat Egypt. He did so while showing mercy to anyone willing to acknowledge his authority, providing warnings before judgments, and protecting innocent people from consequences their leaders chose to embrace. Justice and mercy combined in ways that revealed divine character more clearly than any philosophical argument or religious ceremony. Egypt will eventually recover some measure of prosperity and influence, but never again will Egyptians claim that their gods are supreme or their civilization is divinely favored above all others. The memory of 10 plagues and a Hebrew exodus will humble Egyptian pride for centuries, serving as a permanent reminder that human power, however impressive, remains subject to divine authority. And somewhere in the desert, a nation that spent 4 centuries in slavery is learning to walk free under the protection of a God who keeps his promises, demonstrates his power against any opposition, and transforms former slaves into a people whose story will inspire hope in oppressed people throughout history. The night is quiet now in Egypt, but it's the quiet of ending, not peace. Tomorrow will bring the hard work of rebuilding a shattered civilization, but it will be rebuilding without the confidence, the workforce, or the wealth that made Egypt great. The age of Egyptian supremacy is over, ended not by military defeat or gradual decline, but by 10 supernatural judgments that revealed the limitations of human power when it conflicts with divine will. You close your eyes, trying to find sleep in a world that will never be the same, knowing that you've witnessed the end of one age and the beginning of another. The God of the Hebrews has spoken, and his voice has changed everything.